In the spring of 1943, a group of high-ranking German naval officers gathered in a secure briefing room in Berlin to review the latest intelligence reports from the Atlantic. The war at sea was reaching a critical phase. German U-boats had been sinking Allied merchant ships at an alarming rate, cutting the lifelines that connected America to Britain and the Soviet Union. The Kriegsmarine believed they were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Then, the intelligence officer presented a report that seemed so absurd, so mathematically impossible, that several officers in the room actually laughed out loud. The report stated that American shipyards were completing a new Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, every single day. Not every week. Not every month. Every single day. Some yards were reportedly launching a new ship every 48 hours. The officer presenting the data emphasized that this information had been verified through multiple sources, including neutral observers, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications. But the German officers simply couldn't accept it. Their own shipbuilding industry, even working at maximum capacity with access to resources from across occupied Europe, could maybe produce one such vessel every few months. The idea that America could build them faster than Germany could sink them seemed to violate basic principles of industrial production. One admiral dismissed the report entirely, suggesting it was Allied disinformation meant to discourage U-boat crews. Another proposed that perhaps the Americans were counting partially completed vessels or simply moving ships between yards to create the illusion of greater production. A third officer, more thoughtful than the others, wondered aloud if perhaps the intelligence was accurate, but the ships being produced were of such poor quality that they would fall apart in rough seas without German intervention. The consensus in the room was that while American industrial capacity was certainly formidable, these numbers had to be exaggerated. No nation on Earth could possibly build ships that quickly. The laws of physics and manufacturing simply didn't allow it. What those German officers didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend from within their traditional framework of industrial production, was that America had fundamentally reinvented how ships were built. The United States hadn't just scaled up existing shipbuilding methods. They had completely revolutionized the entire process, applying mass production techniques that had been developed for automobiles and applying them to vessels that weighed thousands of tons. It was an industrial achievement so profound that it would change not just the outcome of World War II, but the entire global economy in the decades that followed. To understand the magnitude of what America accomplished, we need to step back and look at how ships had traditionally been built. For thousands of years, shipbuilding had been a craft industry. Skilled workers would construct each vessel individually, custom-fitting each component, using techniques that had been passed down through generations. Even in the early 20th century, building a large cargo ship was a process that took many months and required hundreds of specialized craftsmen. Each ship was essentially unique, built to specific requirements, with components manufactured on-site or brought in from various suppliers. The entire process was slow, labor-intensive, and expensive. The Liberty ship program threw all of that tradition out the window. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Design one standard ship that could be mass-produced using prefabricated components and assembly line techniques. Instead of building each ship from the keel up as a unique project, the Liberty ships would be constructed from modular sections that were manufactured in factories far from the shipyards, then transported to the yards for rapid assembly. It was the difference between a custom-built house and a prefabricated structure. The Germans, with their emphasis on engineering excellence and individual craftsmanship, simply couldn't conceive of building ships this way. The man who made this vision a reality was Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built a ship in his life before World War II. Kaiser had made his fortune in construction, building dams and highways using innovative techniques that emphasized speed and efficiency. When the war began, and America needed merchant ships desperately, Kaiser proposed applying construction industry methods to shipbuilding. Established shipbuilders were skeptical. The Maritime Commission was hesitant. But Kaiser had powerful allies and an infectious optimism, and eventually he received contracts to build Liberty ships at yards he would construct from scratch on the West Coast. Kaiser's approach was to break down the ship into sections that could be built simultaneously in different locations. The hull was divided into modular pieces. The deck houses, engine rooms, and other components were prefabricated, complete with wiring and piping and equipment already installed. These sections would then be transported to the shipyard, where they would be welded together in a matter of days rather than riveted together over months. It required rethinking everything about how shipyards operated, how workers were trained, and how components were manufactured and delivered. It was industrial engineering on a scale that had never been attempted before. The German naval intelligence officers, reading reports about this process, struggled to believe it was possible because their own experience told them it shouldn't work. German shipyards employed master craftsmen who had trained for years to develop their skills. These men took pride in their work, fitting each component precisely, ensuring that every weld and rivet met exacting standards. The idea of using prefabricated sections welded together by workers who might have been farmers or shopkeepers just months before seemed ludicrous. Surely such ships would be structurally unsound. Surely they would break apart in Atlantic storms or crack under the stress of a full cargo load. The Germans convinced themselves that even if America was producing ships quickly, they must be producing floating coffins that would solve Germany's problem by sinking themselves. They were wrong. The Liberty ships, while certainly not elegant or particularly fast, were remarkably robust. The all-welded construction, which the Germans viewed with suspicion, actually made the ships stronger than traditionally riveted vessels in many ways. Yes, there were some early failures. Some ships did crack, particularly in cold northern waters where the steel became brittle. But American engineers quickly identified the problems, modified the design, and implemented solutions. The ships kept coming, an endless stream of cargo capacity flooding into the Atlantic faster than U-boats could possibly sink them. And each ship represented not just 10,000 tons of cargo capacity, but a psychological blow to Germany's hope of winning the war through naval blockade. The numbers were staggering. In 1941, before the Liberty ship program really hit its stride, American shipyards produced about 1 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1942, that number jumped to 8 million tons. In 1943, it reached 19 million tons. By 1944, American yards were producing more merchant shipping tonnage in a single month than Germany had sunk in an entire year at the height of the U-boat campaign. The mathematical reality was brutal and undeniable. America could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over, decided not by admirals and submarines, but by welders and assembly lines. Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 in California set the record that became legendary. On November 12, 1942, the yard launched the SS Robert E. Peary just 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes after laying her keel. 4 days to build a complete 10,000-ton cargo ship. The event was deliberately staged as a publicity stunt and morale booster, with workers specially selected and everything pre-positioned for maximum speed. But even accounting for the special circumstances, it demonstrated what was possible when mass production techniques were fully embraced. Regular production ships were taking about 42 days from keel laying to launch by late 1943, and that included ships being built by workers who had never set foot in a shipyard before the war started. German officers examining these reports faced a cognitive dissonance that must have been deeply unsettling. On one hand, the evidence was overwhelming. Neutral diplomats were reporting it. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic were spotting more and more ships. U-boat commanders were radioing back that despite their success in sinking vessels, the overall number of Allied ships seemed to be increasing rather than decreasing. But accepting the reports at face value meant accepting that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American industrial power. It meant acknowledging that the war might already be lost, that no amount of German technical superiority or fighting spirit could overcome such a massive material disadvantage. The German response reveals how difficult it was for them to adjust their thinking. Rather than accepting that American methods were simply more efficient for this particular purpose, they convinced themselves that there had to be hidden weaknesses. Intelligence analysts wrote reports speculating that the Liberty ships must be using inferior steel, that their engines must be unreliable, that their cargo capacity must be exaggerated. They created elaborate theories about how these ships were probably suitable only for short coastal runs, not true ocean crossings. They suggested that the ships must require constant repairs and that American ports must be clogged with broken-down Liberty ships waiting for parts. None of this was true, but believing it allowed German leadership to maintain the illusion that they were still competitive in the production war. The truth was visible to anyone willing to see it. By mid-1943, Liberty ships were everywhere. They were carrying tanks to North Africa, food to Britain, oil to the Soviet Union through the dangerous Arctic convoys. They were being torpedoed by U-boats, and many were indeed lost, but for every one that sank, 3 more slid down the ways in American shipyards. Some Liberty ships were converted into emergency repair vessels, following convoys and fixing damaged ships at sea. Others were modified into tankers, troop transports, or even auxiliary aircraft carriers. The design was so robust and the production so abundant that losing a Liberty ship, while certainly regrettable, was not a strategic setback. They had become disposable in a way that no previous large ship had ever been. The workforce that built these ships was as revolutionary as the production methods. Before the war, shipbuilding had been an exclusively male profession, dominated by skilled craftsmen who had served long apprenticeships. The Liberty ship program needed tens of thousands of workers immediately, and there was no time for traditional training. So Kaiser and other shipbuilders recruited whoever was available. Women, elderly men, minorities who had been excluded from skilled trades, and people who had never done industrial work. They developed simplified training programs that could teach someone to make acceptable welds in a matter of weeks. They broke down complex jobs into simple, repeatable tasks that didn't require years of experience. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic symbol of this transformation, though Liberty ships actually used welding rather than riveting. Women made up a significant portion of the shipyard workforce, doing jobs that society had insisted only men could perform. They operated cranes, welded hull sections, and installed complex machinery. Some of the most productive welders in Kaiser's yards were women who had been homemakers just months before. The Germans, reading intelligence reports about American shipyards, staffed partially by women and unskilled workers, took this as further confirmation that the ships must be poorly built. In their military culture, which emphasized traditional gender roles and respect for technical expertise, the idea that housewives could build warships seemed absurd, but the American approach worked precisely because it didn't rely on individual skill and craftsmanship. The system was designed so that people with minimal training could produce acceptable results by following standardized procedures. The design of the Liberty ship was intentionally simple, with parts that were interchangeable and processes that were foolproof. Quality control was built into the system through inspection at multiple stages, rather than relying on each worker to be an expert. It was the industrial equivalent of McDonald's hamburger, not gourmet, but consistently adequate and produced in enormous quantities. The economic implications of this production achievement were staggering. Each Liberty ship cost approximately $2 million to build, roughly $200,000 per 1,000 tons of cargo capacity. For comparison, a traditional cargo ship built before the war might cost 3 or 4 times as much per ton of capacity and take much longer to complete. This meant that America could not only outproduce Germany, but could do so while spending less per unit of capacity. The efficiency gains from mass production were so enormous that they fundamentally altered the economics of the war. Germany was trying to win an industrial conflict while being massively outproduced by an opponent who was also spending less per unit of output. The mathematics were impossible. German economic planners eventually had to confront these realities. Albert Speer, who became Minister of Armaments in 1942, was more realistic than many Nazi leaders about Germany's industrial situation. He pushed for rationalization of German production, trying to introduce some of the efficiency measures that made American industry so productive. But he was fighting against a system that emphasized small batch production of technically sophisticated weapons rather than mass production of adequate ones. German factories produced tanks that were superior to American Sherman tanks in many ways, but they produced them in much smaller numbers and at much higher cost per unit. The same pattern held across almost every category of military equipment. The Liberty ship program demonstrated a fundamental principle that the Germans struggled to accept. In industrial warfare, adequate equipment produced in overwhelming quantities beats superior equipment produced in limited numbers. A Liberty ship was not as fast as a German blockade runner, not as well built as a traditional German cargo vessel, and certainly not as prestigious. But there were thousands of them. They were available when and where they were needed, and they got the job done. The German merchant marine, by contrast, was largely trapped in port, unable to safely operate in waters dominated by Allied air and naval power. Quality didn't matter if quantity was insufficient. The psychological impact on German naval officers of watching this industrial tide turn against them must have been profound. These were men who had been trained to value technical excellence, tactical brilliance, and the warrior ethos. They belonged to a service that took pride in its professionalism and effectiveness. The idea that they could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers of adequately good ships built by hastily trained workers ran counter to everything their culture and training had taught them. Some adapted and tried to find new tactics. Others retreated into denial, insisting until the end of the war that German technical superiority would eventually prevail. None of them could stop the flood of ships pouring out of American yards. By 1944, the Liberty ship program had achieved something unprecedented in industrial history. America had built over 2,500 Liberty ships, representing more than 30 million tons of cargo capacity. To put that in perspective, that was more merchant shipping tonnage than the entire British merchant fleet. The world's largest before the war had possessed in 1939. America had not just replaced its losses, it had created a merchant fleet larger than any that had ever existed, and it had done so in less than 3 years. The implications for the post-war world were obvious even while the war was still raging. America would emerge as the dominant maritime power, able to shape global trade and project power across any ocean. The German Navy's failure to understand and adapt to American shipbuilding capacity was part of a larger pattern of German strategic miscalculation. Hitler and his inner circle had convinced themselves that America was a weak, decadent society that lacked the will and ability to wage industrial war. They saw American culture through a lens of propaganda that emphasized labor disputes, racial tensions, and materialism while ignoring the enormous productive capacity and organizational skill that American society could mobilize when properly motivated. The Liberty ship was concrete proof that their assumptions were completely wrong, but ideology prevented them from accepting this evidence until it was far too late. There's a particular German naval intelligence report from late 1943 that captures this cognitive dissonance perfectly. The analyst who wrote it meticulously documented American ship production numbers, noted the launching rates at various yards, and calculated the total tonnage being added to Allied capacity each month. The numbers clearly showed that Germany had lost the tonnage war. But the report concluded by suggesting that these ships must be inferior, that they must suffer from design flaws that would become apparent over time, and that Germany should therefore maintain its current strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The analyst couldn't bring himself to recommend the obvious conclusion that Germany needed to fundamentally rethink its naval strategy because the material balance had shifted beyond recovery. The human cost of this German failure to comprehend American industrial power was measured in thousands of U-boat crewmen who went to sea in submarines that were increasingly obsolete, facing improving Allied anti-submarine tactics and escort carriers, all while pursuing a strategy that could no longer achieve its objectives. The U-boat service suffered approximately 75% casualties during the war, one of the highest loss rates of any military service in any nation. Many of those men died in 1944 and 1945, long after it should have been obvious that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. They died because German leadership couldn't accept that American factories had simply outproduced German strategy. The Liberty ship program also demonstrated American organizational capabilities that went far beyond just building ships quickly. Each ship had to be crewed, which required training thousands of merchant seamen. They had to be loaded with cargo, which required coordinating with military planners and industrial producers. They had to be routed safely across oceans patrolled by U-boats and aircraft, which required sophisticated convoy systems and naval escorts. They had to be unloaded at their destinations, often in primitive port facilities that had to be expanded or constructed from scratch. The shipyards themselves represented another area where German observers completely misunderstood what they were seeing. Kaiser's Richmond yards in California had been empty land in early 1941. Within months, they had been transformed into massive industrial complexes with building ways, cranes, prefabrication shops, and all the infrastructure needed to build ships. The Germans knew this had happened because reconnaissance reports and intelligence intercepts confirmed it, but they couldn't grasp the implications. In Germany, building a new shipyard was a multi-year project, requiring extensive planning, specialized construction, and careful integration into existing industrial networks. The idea that you could create a shipyard from nothing in a matter of months suggested a flexibility and speed of industrial mobilization that seemed impossible. What the Germans didn't understand was that American construction companies had developed expertise in rapid large-scale building during the Depression era, when government projects like the Hoover Dam had required mobilizing thousands of workers and vast amounts of equipment in remote locations. Kaiser himself had been involved in building the Grand Coulee Dam, a project that required moving more concrete than had ever been moved before, in a location that had no existing infrastructure. The skills and methods developed on these projects translated directly to building shipyards. When Kaiser needed a new yard, he simply applied the same techniques: modular construction, prefabricated components, standardized designs, and aggressive scheduling. What seemed miraculous to German observers was simply American construction expertise applied to a new problem. The training programs developed for Liberty ship workers were another innovation that German observers struggled to understand. Traditional German apprenticeship models required years of training under master craftsmen. American shipyards couldn't wait years. They developed intensive short-term training programs that focused on teaching specific skills needed for specific jobs. A worker didn't need to understand every aspect of shipbuilding. They needed to know how to make one type of weld, or operate one type of crane, or install one type of pipe fitting. The training was narrow but deep enough for the specific task. Then, quality control inspectors, who did have broader expertise, would check the work. This division of labor allowed yards to take someone off the street and have them productively contributing to ship construction within weeks. German military culture viewed this approach with contempt. They believed that only fully trained craftsmen could produce quality work, and they pointed to occasional Liberty ship failures as proof that American methods were flawed. But they missed the larger picture. Yes, some Liberty ships had problems. Some even broke apart. But the rate of serious failures was actually quite low given the scale of production and the speed of construction. And when failures occurred, American engineers quickly identified the causes, developed fixes, and implemented them across the entire fleet. The system was designed to learn and improve continuously, something that German bureaucracy, with its rigid hierarchies and compartmentalized responsibilities, struggled to do. The welding technology used on Liberty ships was itself a point of German skepticism. Traditional ship construction used rivets, which required skilled workers to heat and install properly. Welding was faster, but had been viewed as less reliable, particularly for large structures subjected to the stresses of ocean travel. American metallurgists and welding engineers had developed new techniques and standards specifically for Liberty ship construction. They created standardized welding procedures, developed quality control methods using X-rays to inspect welds, and trained workers in these specific techniques. The result was welded construction that was actually stronger and more reliable than riveted construction in most applications. But German naval architects, trained in traditional methods, continued to believe that riveted construction was superior even as evidence mounted that they were wrong. By 1944, some German officers were finally beginning to understand the full scope of what America had accomplished. Intelligence reports became harder to dismiss as propaganda when U-boat commanders were radioing back that they were encountering convoys of 30, 40, even 50 merchant ships, most of them identical Liberty ships. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed dozens of Liberty ships in every major Allied port. Captured American sailors and merchant seamen confirmed the production numbers and described the shipyard operations. The evidence became overwhelming, but understanding the problem and being able to do anything about it were two different things. Germany lacked the resources, the industrial base, and frankly the time to develop any kind of response. Some German strategists proposed focusing on quality over quantity in merchant ship sinking. targeting specific types of cargo like oil tankers or ships carrying critical supplies. This made some tactical sense, but it couldn't change the fundamental mathematics. Even if every U-boat sortie sank a high-value target, there simply weren't enough U-boats and they weren't sinking ships fast enough to offset American production. The strategic situation had become hopeless, but the U-boat campaign continued, driven partly by Hitler's refusal to accept defeat and partly by institutional momentum within the Kriegsmarine that couldn't conceive of abandoning the fight. The post-war period revealed just how thoroughly American shipbuilding had transformed global maritime commerce. Thousands of Liberty ships survived the war and entered commercial service. They became the backbone of post-war merchant fleets, carrying cargo around the world and helping rebuild war-torn economies. Some remained in service for decades. The construction techniques and mass production methods pioneered for the Liberty ship influenced all subsequent merchant ship construction. The modular design approach, prefabrication, welding, and assembly line techniques became standard industry practice. In a very real sense, the modern global shipping industry that moves trillions of dollars worth of goods annually was born in those emergency wartime shipyards. German naval officers who survived the war and later studied what had happened came to understand that they had witnessed a genuine revolution in industrial production. Some wrote memoirs or gave interviews where they admitted that they simply hadn't believed the intelligence reports at the time because the numbers seemed impossible. They had evaluated American capability based on their own industrial experience and convinced themselves that America couldn't possibly be doing what it was actually doing. This failure of imagination, this inability to conceive that another nation might have fundamentally different and superior methods of industrial organization, had contributed significantly to Germany's defeat. The Liberty ship story also reveals something important about the nature of technological and industrial advantage in modern warfare. The ships themselves weren't particularly advanced technology. The design was deliberately simple and conservative, using proven concepts rather than cutting-edge innovations. The engines were reliable but not powerful. The hull design was efficient but not revolutionary. What made the Liberty ship program transformative wasn't the technology of the ships themselves, but the technology and organization of how they were built. The real innovation was in production methods, workforce training, supply chain management, and quality control systems. These organizational and process innovations were less visible than a new weapon or a faster airplane, but they were ultimately more decisive. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. German weapons were often technically superior to their American equivalents on a one-to-one basis. German tanks had better guns and armor. German submarines were more sophisticated. German aircraft had innovative features. But America produced adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities, and adequate weapons in large numbers beat superior weapons in small numbers. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as a Panther or Tiger, but there were 5 Shermans for every German heavy tank. American submarines weren't as sophisticated as German U-boats, but there were enough of them to strangle Japan's merchant marine. And Liberty ships, plain and simple as they were, buried Germany's hope of winning through naval blockade under an avalanche of cargo capacity. The human dimension of the Liberty ship story deserves emphasis. The workers who built these ships were ordinary Americans who responded to their nation's call in a time of crisis. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions, doing physically demanding labor that required concentration and skill despite the simplified training. Shipyard accidents killed and injured thousands of workers. The work was exhausting, often performed in extreme heat or cold depending on location and season. Yet productivity continued to increase throughout the war as workers gained experience and took pride in their contribution to the war effort. This mobilization of civilian labor for industrial production was as important as military mobilization in determining the war's outcome. The Liberty ship program also demonstrated American capitalism's ability to mobilize for national purposes when properly incentivized. Henry Kaiser and other shipbuilders were private contractors working for profit, not government employees. They had strong financial incentives to build ships quickly and efficiently because their contracts rewarded speed and volume. This harnessing of profit motive to serve national goals was something the German war economy, with its chaotic mix of party control, military authority, and private industry, never managed to achieve efficiently. American shipbuilders got rich building Liberty ships, and America got the ships it needed. Both parties benefited, and the synergy produced results that purely state-directed production might not have achieved. Looking back from this perspective of military history, the German failure to comprehend American shipbuilding capacity stands as a case study in strategic miscalculation. Intelligence exists not in isolation, but within interpretive frameworks shaped by culture, experience, and ideology. The German officers who laughed at reports of American shipbuilding weren't stupid or incompetent. They were smart, experienced professionals who couldn't conceive of industrial production methods that were radically different from what they knew. Their skepticism was reasonable given their frame of reference, but reasonable skepticism became strategic blindness when they refused to update their understanding in the face of mounting evidence. This same pattern of miscalculation affected German strategic thinking across multiple domains. They underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and resilience. They underestimated Britain's ability to absorb punishment and continue fighting. They underestimated American military potential and will to fight. In each case, German leadership started with assumptions shaped by ideology and limited understanding, received intelligence that contradicted those assumptions, and then rejected or reinterpreted the intelligence rather than updating their worldview. The Liberty ship was just one example of this broader pattern, but it was a particularly clear one because the numbers were so stark and undeniable. The final accounting of the Liberty ship program is impressive by any measure. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, totaling over 29 million deadweight tons of cargo capacity. At peak production in 1943, a new Liberty ship was being completed on average every 8 hours. The program employed hundreds of thousands of workers, consumed millions of tons of steel, and cost billions of dollars. But it worked. It helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. It kept Britain supplied and fighting. It supported every major Allied amphibious operation. It carried the material that rebuilt Europe after the war. And it demonstrated once and for all that American industrial power, when fully mobilized, was unmatched in human history. For the German officers who finally understood what they had been facing, the realization must have been bitter. They had fought bravely and skillfully against an opponent whose true strength they had never comprehended until it was too late. Their U-boat crews had died by the thousands, pursuing a strategy that couldn't succeed because the fundamental assumption underlying it, that Germany could sink ships faster than America could build them, had been wrong from the start. The war might have turned out differently if German leadership had understood American industrial capacity earlier and adjusted strategy accordingly. But they didn't understand, couldn't understand, until American Liberty ships filled every ocean and Allied cargo capacity exceeded anything the world had ever seen. The legacy of the Liberty ship extends beyond World War II into the entire post-war era. The organizational methods, production techniques, and industrial processes developed to build Liberty ships influenced American manufacturing across multiple industries. The experience of training unskilled workers quickly and effectively informed post-war vocational education programs. The demonstration that women could perform industrial work previously reserved for men contributed to changing social attitudes about gender and employment. The proof that mass production methods could be applied to large, complex products encouraged similar approaches in other industries. In countless ways, the Liberty ship program helped create the industrial and social landscape of modern America. And somewhere in the archives, there are probably German intelligence reports from 1943, carefully typed and filed, presenting accurate data about American shipbuilding capacity and concluding that it must be exaggerated or flawed somehow, because the officers reading those reports simply couldn't comprehend how American factories were building a ship every single day. They learned the truth eventually, but by then it was far too late to matter. The ships kept coming, an endless tide of industrial output that overwhelmed German naval strategy and helped carry the Allies to victory. The impossible had become routine, and the routine had changed the world forever.